Hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about something really exciting called geometry nodes. I say it's exciting because it's something relatively new to Blender. I'm not sure when exactly it came out. I didn't really look it up, but it wasn't here, let's say 3 years ago, I think. So it's fairly new. And I don't really have a lot of practice with it, but I've created a bunch of things with geometry nodes, and some of them are already on my Instagram. So I'll recreate two of those because they're the ones that I usually use geometry nodes for. The first thing is if I wanted to create a weight map using a texture. We haven't talked about textures yet, and I'm going to talk briefly about them in this video, just so you understand what is happening. And I'll also talk about weight maps and what they are, or vertex maps. They have multiple names because they show up in different ways. With edit mode, they're vertices, but in weight paint mode, they're shown as a weight map, kind of similar to heat maps. And they go from blue to red. So they go from blue to green to yellow, orange to red. Blue being the coolest, and then red is where things are happening. And then the second thing I use geometry nodes for is to scatter objects on a screen. So if you've looked at my notes on execution post, then you'll see that I have scattered a saffron spice particles all around the screen, and I use geometry nodes for that. It just makes things easier for me, and I can scatter a collection of objects, one object. It can be anything really. But believe me, there are a lot more uses for geometry nodes that you can find online, and I will try to link to a few artists who are amazing at it. So yeah, I'm not going to show you that because I really don't know much about geometry nodes, but I'll show you the things that I've tried several times before. And in this video, I'll be able to also show you my thumbnail and how I used each of the tips that I showed you in that. In the previous tutorial, I didn't show my thumbnail explanation because it was animation based and my thumbnail didn't really have any animation. I just tried to mimic the curves and show some elements that I've used this with before, or I've used that tutorial with before. Okay, I like to go to the geometry nodes tab. You can add a workspace, or you can adjust any of the ones that you have already. I do adjust the layout one often because it already has everything I need, and I just need to add one window. But for geometry nodes, I'm going to just use the geometry nodes workspace that is created by default in Blender. And the first thing you need to do is add an object, because geometry nodes is technically a modifier. So let's add an object. Depending on what you want to do, that will determine what object you're going to choose. So if I want to scatter stuff, I don't really care about the object itself. Sometimes I do, because if I want to scatter objects based on the volume of the shape that I have, then I need to choose a shape that is going to scatter my objects correctly in the scene, how I want them to look. However, if you are just going to distribute points and then randomize their movement or their transformation, then it doesn't really matter what shape you're going to choose. But let's start with the weight map. For that, I do need good topology. So I'm going to start with a round cube because I'm going to use the cloth modifier with it as well. So I just open the toggle down here, and then I'll put the radius at 1 so it looks like a circle or a sphere. And then you can either go from the modifier properties and add a geometry nodes modifier, which is under the generate section because it is generating stuff. Or you can just do new over here. This is the geometry nodes editor. So I'm just going to select this, hit new, and I'll see that the modifier is added over here. And the name over here is geometry nodes 0.001 because I already have other geometry nodes, because I've already created my thumbnail on this file. And the first thing you're going to see is a group input and a group output. Don't be scared by this. It's fairly simple. It doesn't really require much. What's complicated about geometry nodes is the mathematics that you need to add onto your object in order to create something unique. And that depends on your level of physics skills and math skills. But yeah, it's really, really simple to do. If I remove this from the group output, then I don't see anything because this is the group input, which is the actual round cube. And then I need to put it into a group output in order to see what is outputted after whatever happens in between. Now, because nothing happened, it's simply plotting whatever is coming from here out. And so it gives me the exact same shape that I had before. Now, what I need is to blow up this shape, but only at certain areas. And I can do this with weight map paint myself, or I can even pin it myself using the vertex groups over here. So if I go into edit mode, hit tab, go into edit mode, we're going to go into a lot of territories that we haven't gone into before. So it's fine if you freak out or if you have a lot of questions, just let me know. It's all easy if you understand it and if you practice. Now, I'm in edit mode. I can select certain vertices and I can add a group and assign those vertices to it. So let's actually add a group, assign it, and then if I click outside and I hit select over here, it's going to select the parts that I've assigned it to this group. So now I already have something assigned to this group. And you can use it for a lot of things that use vertex groups. Now, if I go out of edit mode, nothing happens, but then I can go to weight paint and I can already see the 2 points that I've selected in edit mode. So if I go to edit mode, you can see that they're at the same exact place. And as I told you before, red is where the action is happening, and then the blue is where things are not affected at all. And then the in-between is just going from the red to the blue. And the reason why this is not very smooth is because there is no subdivision on this surface. So let's add a subdivision surface and let's add it before the geometry nodes. And you'll notice that the geometry nodes editor is empty now. It's just because we are selecting or we're activating the subdivision modifier instead of the geometry nodes modifier. So if I just click on this, then it's gonna come back. And you can see that it's much smoother now. If I add even one more subdivision, you'll see that it's even smoother. And I can also go to edit mode, add, let's say, a point in the center to the group, assign it. If I select, then all of them are assigned. Go out of edit mode with tab. As I said before, whatever mode you're on, it's going to go to edit mode if you hit tab. So because we are in weight paint, if I hit edit mode or if I hit tab to go into edit mode and then go out of it, it's going to go back to the one that I've activated before, the edit mode. So now you can see that it's aligned. And that's because all of the vertices are next to each other. And so it's going to color it red and then it's going to fade out to blue. So that's the connection between the vertex groups and the weight paint. Now let's go to object mode and also let's delete this group because I want to show you something later. When you don't have a group, what happens? Okay, now I can go to add and then textures, and I'll add a Voronoi texture. You can experiment with all of these. We can also do a wave texture. I'll show you too, so you can actually see how this works. But we'll start with a Voronoi texture. There's also a view node that you can add, or a viewer node. And a viewer node shows you what is happening with these. So if I put the geometry in here, and then I put the distance in here, and I show it, we can actually see what is happening. But note that if this is turned on, if this is activated with the eye turned on, then you're only going to see whatever you plugged into the viewer. However, if you close this, then you're seeing what is actually being output. So this is the final render basically. But let's actually turn on the viewer so we can see what is going on. Now with textures, you have multiple settings that you can play around with. For the Voronoi texture, it's very simple. You have a scale and a randomness. If you remove the randomness, then you get something grid-like. And if you scale it up and down, then you can actually see it moving. And then you also have distance, color, and position. So if I plot the color in here, you can see a different look. And if you have position, you can also see a different look. If you want to know the exact reasoning behind all of these, then you're going to have to look up tutorials on what these textures mean and their settings. What I like to do is just experiment. I like distance the majority of the time, and I like it to be random. You see how it's different when it's random? And then I like a very big scale. And you can also change this from 3D to 1D, 2D, or 4D. 4D makes it loop better. And then there's F1, F2, smooth F1, distance to edge, and sphere radius. They all have different looks. But you're not going to see exactly what is happening because everything is just blurry. And the way we can fix that is by adding a color ramp. At first, you're going to find yourself just memorizing all of these because you don't really understand what is happening. But all I know is that this Voronoi texture have a certain look that I want. And I know that they're blurry, and in order to make them a little bit crispier, I have to add a color ramp to kind of adjust the mapping of the colors. So instead of having black as very small and then fading into white, it's way too smooth for me. So I have to just get them next to each other so I can kind of reduce that gradient. So I'm simply making that gradient a smaller range, and so it doesn't really go further out from the black to the white, and it just goes from black to white straight ahead. You can also go from linear to constant, which is going to do the exact same thing. It's simply just removing the gradient altogether. The only reason we are seeing gradients is because this is not subdivided enough. And I'm also going to shade it smooth, but it's not going to do anything to it. You can go over here and you can pull from any of those points and it'll give you a plus icon. And if you leave it, you can search for the things that you want to add onto it, and it's going to show you the things that can be attached to it and nothing else. So let's say shade smooth. I know I don't really memorize all of these. It's just with practice you start memorizing things, and I've learned this from coding in general because that's how I started into the digital art world. I started learning web development, or specifically front-end web development, and it taught me to research and look up the documentation in order to find out what I need by simply stating what it is that you need. So you don't really require a lot of complex terminology. Like if you look up, let's say, why isn't my object not smooth, then people will tell you how to do that. And if you add geometry nodes to it, then they will also tell you how to do that. Sometimes even documentation come up when you Google something related to geometry nodes, even with the simplest terminology. So never worry about memorizing any of these. I don't really remember the half of it, and sometimes I do go back and research. And the same goes with code, especially if you're out of practice with it. Okay, so set shade smooth and then smooth shading it. But you'll have to put it in here so you can actually see it if it does make a change. You can also subdivide your objects in geometry nodes over here. I do that sometimes, but because I can add a modifier before the geometry nodes, it's fine because that's going to be the input anyway. So if I remove this, you can see that it's not applying to it because whatever comes before geometry nodes is considered an input as well. Okay, let's add multiple subdivisions, or let's even try to create the subdivision over here. So if I just do subdivide and I choose surface, because mesh is going to make it a little weird because I think it follows this simple subdivision, not the Catmull-Clark or whatever it's called. So I'll do subdivision surface and then I'll attach it to this. So it's a chain of tasks, basically. This goes to mesh. Because it's green, you can apply it to geometry, or you can input it into geometry and then geometry goes to the output, or here it also goes to the viewer so we can actually see it. And let's deactivate this and then add the levels over here. And we already have the subdivision here, so we don't really need this one. And now you can see that the Voronoi texture is a bunch of circles on top of each other. And if I go to color, it's just a weird blob. And if I go to position, then it looks like that, because I think it goes based on the position of each vertex. The round cube is basically an array of vertices. So each one of those, let's actually deactivate the viewer. So each one of those has a position. And based on that, this is outputting information. And this is based on distance. So the distance between the points. I use distance because I understand the building blocks of. It's basically calculating the distance between a bunch of points that are scattered on the object, even in 2D. And based on that distance, it actually inflates those circles to a point where if they collide with each other, then they just start to kind of make an edge. And you won't actually see it here. You will definitely see it in the other ones. So let's actually, I'm trying to figure out which one. Okay, this is what a Voronoi texture actually look like. So based on the distance between this point and this edge emerged because the circle starts to get bigger to a point where it can't really get any bigger since there is another circle right next to it that it collided with. And so it's just going to flatten its points to a point where it creates an edge with its neighboring points. And it's called distance to edge, and it only has the distance. But I like to use F1. I don't really know what all of these mean. Distance to edge is the one that I actually know visually. But I use F1 a lot and smooth F1. And if I go back, now we have a bunch of circles. And this is what I want to use in order to inflate my object. And you can just adjust this until you're happy with it. I like a very big scale so I can actually see pinned areas and try to fix this so they're not all sticking to each other. Now I can output this into a weight map or a vertex group. You have this output, you can see it in the viewer, so you know that you're happy with it. Now you can put this output here, and that will create a new output point or a new output value. And you can click on it and adjust what it is. We're going to need it to be a float, and the attribute domain is a point. And then we can go to the output attributes over here, and I can also rename it. So if I double click it, or I can change the name over here, I can, let's say, vertex group, and it's renamed over here. And now you can choose the vertex group, but we don't really have a vertex group to add this to it. And that's why I wanted to delete the previous vertex group, because just as I was creating the thumbnail, because I haven't done this in a while, I didn't know why I couldn't find my vertex group over here, but I kind of forgot that I didn't add it in the first place. So let's actually go into edit mode. And if I just disable the viewer, we can actually see our edit mode, vertices. And now I can add a vertex group. And you can call it whatever. I'm going to call it pin because it's going to be the pin points in our cloth. So those are the ones that are going to be pinned and not puffed up. And I'm going to not assign anything to it right now and go back into object mode. And then I can go over here and choose my pin point. So now I already assigned whatever is happening over here into my vertex group. And if I go to weight paint, I can actually see my vertices. And you can already see that these are pinned. So this is the vertex group that I'm pinning, the red, and then these are the blue. If that is happening, then you're on the right track because I want to puff up the circles. So yeah, we have the correct weight paint. I can go back to object mode, and now we can go to the physics tab, add a cloth modifier. Now, this is when you're going to find it really complicated because I haven't really talked about the cloth modifier, and we're technically talking about geometry nodes, but I just want to show you how it works in the end. And you'll find out that geometry nodes is very nice in adding certain things to your workflow in Blender, even if you don't really want to create an entire shape using geometry nodes. So instead of just going to weight paint and painting things by hand, you can just use textures. And geometry nodes is going to help you with that. Now let's go to cloth. It's an unknown territory, I know. If I go to cloth and it adds it to the modifiers. That's why our geometry nodes disappeared, because it's not selected. The cloth modifier is selected. You can select it back and then go to the physics tab, and I'm going to go down to shape. In shape, you're going to see a pin group, and that's where you're going to find a vertex group icon, and that's when you're going to click here, choose pin. So anything with this icon, you can choose a vertex group with. So if I go over here, you can see it looks like this. So anything over here or anywhere that looks like this, meaning you can use a vertex group with it. So you're basically selecting part of the mesh to do something with. And here it says pin group, so it's going to pin that part of the fabric and the rest is going to move. So if I hit space to run the animation, and I can also add the timeline over here. I can go timeline, and now we can see what is happening. And now if I hit space, at the beginning it's going to be slow, and depending on your computer, this might be really slow or really fast. But don't worry if it freezes for a bit or if it's trying to run the animation, but you're not really seeing anything, because it's definitely based on how heavy your mesh is, how complicated your mesh is, and what you're using with it. And with cloth modifiers and a highly subdivided surface, then you're gonna get a very slow animation mostly. So let's run this, and we're going to see that the parts that are not pinned are actually falling down like fabric. That is already really cool. And you can also turn it around, but it's going to be really slow. You can actually see it over here. Frames per second is only 1.76 when I actually have a base of 24. So this, for it to run nicely, it should be 24 frames per second. And you can see that the animation is running, and if it says anim player, just as a shortcut probably, then the animation is actually playing. Now what we need to do is puff this up and not let gravity take its course. So let's just stop the animation with the spacebar, and then I'm going to make the gravity 0, and then I'm going to add pressure. You only need probably 2 for the pressure scale. And now if I hit shift and the right arrow or the left arrow, you're going to go back to the first frame, or you can just click the first frame over here, and I'll run it again. We're not seeing anything, but something is actually happening. The only problem is that pressure puts pressure on the object, but if it doesn't really have any room to go out, then it doesn't really show anything. And that's why I'm going to use the shrinking factor in the shape section over here. And I'm going to drag it to the left, because technically this is saying shrinking factor, as in the opposite values are going to shrink the fabric. But if I go the opposite way, then it's going to blow it up or add more fabric. And I'm going to add a little bit more. And now with pressure, it's going to push that extra fabric out. So if I go back to the first frame, again, that's shift left arrow, and I hit space, now we can actually see something happening because I've added some geometry to that area of the fabric. And you can see that everywhere that was red is now pinned, and everywhere that is blue is being inflated. And you can also add a subdivision surface right after the cloth modifier, and it'll make it smoother. We can deactivate it and see how it looks, and now it looks nicer. You can also do shade smooth, but the geometry nodes tree already has a set shade smooth, so it'll always smooth it. And if I go to the viewer, I can actually see that it's being inflated in the same areas that are black. So yeah, now we can adjust this. So if I go right here, I can adjust this, make it a lot bigger. And now let's start the animation. And it doesn't really fix the animation. You have to start from the beginning to run or render whatever simulation you're actually adding to your object. But the reason why this is happening is because there is a lot more fabric than there is pressure. So you can definitely add more pressure for it to actually inflate well, kind of like real life basically. And you can see how nice this looks. We're not talking about materials and textures right now, but just to show you what you can do with this. You can also add another output variable, and you can let it be color. So I'm going to let it be named color, and here as well color. And then if you go to the same tab as this one, instead of creating a vertex group, you can create a color attribute group and just name it whatever you want. I'm going to keep it as color. Hit OK, go to the modifier. Now this part, you're going to see point, color, select it, and in the shading tab, which is not important right now, so don't worry about all of this. But if you have questions, please leave them in the comments below. And if I go to the materials tab, I hit a new material, and then I go to attribute, color attribute, select my color attribute, and put it in the base color. And you can already see that whatever color came out of the geometry nodes is now applied over here. And you can now create a different material for the parts that are puffed up, and a different materials for it, and a different one for the pinned parts. I did this with So You've Been Publicly Shamed post, where these parts I made a little bit more transparent and these parts were just regular, as if this fabric inflates to become really stretched out that it becomes a little bit transparent. So you can definitely play around with this. Now let's create another one, just so we kind of have a little bit more practice. So instead of a Voronoi texture, and let's get the viewer on and go back to the first frame so we don't get any lagging from the animation. Let's add a wave texture and let's plot it into here. You can already see how it looks. I'll start by adding it directly to the viewer, or inputting it into the viewer directly so we can actually see how it looks before applying the color ramp to it and remapping the colors. And you can see that there is a color and there is a factor. I don't really know the difference between the two, but probably one is a vector and the other is a float. So a vector is basically 3 points, as in X, Y, and Z, and then a float is just one number. So let's say you want to only affect the Z position, then you can do separate X, Y, Z, and that way you're getting only the Z value from here and applying it to this, or doing whatever math you want to create with this. This works for me mostly with gradient texture, because it allows me to flip them based on the vector. Let's just delete this. And now let's go back to this. And you can see that there are bands and there are rings. Depending on your object, this texture is going to look different. And then you have on the x-axis, y-axis, and you can see this circle actually going through the y. And then you also have the z. And then you can also do a sine, which is smooth because it goes from -1 to 1 and repeats. And then there is the saw, which I don't really know much about, but all I know is that it's a little bit more rigid. And then there is a triangle, which also I don't really use because I don't really know much about it. I go back and forth between sine and saw, depending on how I want it to look, but the majority of the time I'm using sine, and you can either use bands or rings. Let's use bands, and then let's see which one is the front view. Let's keep it at the front view. Let's reduce the scale, and you can either add some distortion. We'll keep it at 0. You can have details or not, but I think details works with distortion. There is a detail scale, detail roughness, and phase offset. So it's basically moving it. So if you want to animate it or something like that, you can definitely do that by adding or inserting a keyframe and changing the values on the timeline. So it works exactly like we did with location before for inserting a keyframe. And now let's plot this into the color ramp and view this. So you can see that it's not as blurry anymore. I like to do this with things like the cloth modifier because I want to see distinctly where something is pinned and where the others are inflating. But with displacement, let's say, this is not going to look good ever. You need that blurriness in order for things to smooth down into the flat parts or the parts that are not displaced. So yeah, now that we have this, it looks more like a bee. And now let's turn off the viewer node. Let's go to weight paint, and now we can see that we have a different vertex group. And our group is the same. So even if I go to edit mode and I select, there's nothing selected because it's getting its information from geometry nodes. So you can change it as many times as you want without even touching this vertex group. Now if I go over here, this also is going to be the same. You're only changing your geometry nodes tree. And let's go to object mode and see how this looks when it's inflated. Let's run it, and voila. You can definitely increase this or even invert it. So let's say you like this, but you want the parts that are pinned to be the ones that are inflated and the opposite for the ones that are inflated. Now to invert it, you can just, let's actually turn on the viewer first. And then to invert it, you can just switch the colors. And you already have the black parts that are going to be inflated and the white parts are going to be pinned. And now let's turn off the viewer node and run the animation by either hitting space or clicking the play button over here. I know the inflating section is the cool part of all of this, but geometry nodes is really cool because it gives you the opportunity to pin certain areas without needing to paint them yourself or to select the vertices yourself. Okay, now let's do something else with geometry nodes. Now let's add another mesh. This time I'm going to just add a UV sphere, and let's add a new geometry nodes. Again, with the input and output. The second thing that I wanted to share with you is distributing points around your screen. So I can go to add and I can search for points. There's also a curve to points if you added a curve. And then there is also distribute points in volume, which is going to distribute all of the points inside of this sphere. Let's start with points. And I'm going to, instead of inputting whatever I have in here, and this is what I mentioned before, where the object doesn't really matter because these are actual geometry. They're not taking any input, they are the input. And I can just output whatever information is happening over here. Now we have a lot of points, or technically we only have one, but now I have 9 points, but they're all on top of each other. If I change the position of them, they're actually changing together. So if I want to disperse them and scatter them in the space I have, then I'm gonna have to add a random position to them. Do a random value. For this, you're gonna need a vector, but you can also input a float. However, a float is going to give you the same value for all vectors. So it's going to convert it into a vector, but all of the values are going to be the same. So if you plot this in here, it's gonna give you a random value, but because they're all going to be the same, it's going to give you a diagonal line. And the reason for this is because the randomization for the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis are all the same, and they're acting as one number. And so this is moving to the left by the same value as it moving to the back or whatever, and then up. So what you're going to need is to change this into vector. And as I said before, I don't really use geometry nodes that often, and so I keep forgetting how to use things. So if I make mistakes, just please correct me if you know anything about geometry nodes, or if you find any information that is valuable, please share them with the rest. Now I changed this into a vector, and now I can plot this in here, and it's gonna give me a more varied look. And because now it's acting as if every axis is on its own, let's go to the front view and let's hide the camera so we can actually see what is happening. And now I can change the randomization for the x-axis. I can change the randomization for the y-axis, which we cannot see in front view, but it is happening. And then for the z-axis. And random is basically giving you a value from the minimum to the maximum based on the seed. So depending on the seed, you can get a different random value. So let's say you want to animate the seeds so you can get something like this. You can. Now, if you go to the front view or even the side view, you're going to see that they're all on the positive side of things because it is going from a 0 to 1, and the 0 point is right in the center. 1 is going to the right or up, to the right of each axis or up. So you can definitely do -1 for these. And now we're actually seeing them go the opposite way. Now you can change the seeds and you can see different looks. And now you can also add, let's say, 100 points. Now that you have the values over here, instead of changing this from -5 to, let's say, 5, you can definitely multiply them. So you can go like this, multiply, and you can add a value over here. So let's say 5, and then apply this to the position. And now it's going from -5 to 5. Or you can do value and apply 1 for the minimum, and then duplicate it, and 1 for the maximum. Now you can remove this, and you can go from, let's say, -5 to 5, and it's going to give you the same exact look. Because it's a float, it's applying the same value to all of the vector points, and you can actually see it over here. And the same goes for this with a maximum, and it gives you a value of 5 for all axes. And you can also name these. So I can either go to the node tab over here, and I can change the name, or I can hit F2 and rename it. So we can do min value, and the same for here, but max value. So you can definitely organize your stuff, and you can do the same over here, random point position. That's basically how you can scatter objects. But let's say you don't want to scatter points that are not going to be rendered. You want to scatter something like an object of yours that you have created, or let's say a bunch of spheres. You can use the original sphere that you've added, or you can add an object from here. So you can go to mesh, and you can go to primitive. You can add, let's say, an icosphere and use that as your scattered points. It's up to you how you want to do this. Or if you have another object, you can definitely go with object, info, and select it from here. So let's say I want to scatter the book. I can definitely do that. We can try a bunch of things, but how we can scatter that is the important part. I can either just get from this point an input and add something to it. I can add instance on points. And the majority of these are self-explanatory, so they don't really require much understanding, but the documentation is definitely going to help, and some tutorials for these specific nodes are definitely going to help. So I can now plot the instances into the output geometry. We don't see anything because the instances input is empty, and it says empty geometry. So we can add the input geometry. So whatever is hidden right now, the sphere, we can reuse it for the instances. And now we can actually see that for every point we have a sphere, and we can scale that down to, let's say, 0.5, or you can randomize it, which is even cool. So you can go to scale with that and do the same. But for scale, we want all of them to be the same. So I'm going to just duplicate this, rename it so we're not confused. Random sphere scale, random scale, just that. And we'll make it float. So with position, it didn't really work because it's following the same position when we want it to actually randomize the position. But with scale, with something like a sphere or a cube, you don't really want to randomize each axis alone. You can just use a float, and that will ensure that your values are exactly the same for each of the axes. And now you can actually see them scaled. And you're gonna find that there aren't a lot of points at 0, but if the minimum scale is 0, then there is a chance that some of them are going to be scaled at 0, which basically means they're non-existent. So you can definitely do 0.1 and then reduce this just to make them a little less varied in size. Maybe 0.05 for this and 0.3 for this. Now you have a little bit more varied scale, but not too much. But even if you want to go up, it's fine. Just know that there is going to be a lot of clipping, like over here. Before adding the instance, let's add set shade smooth. And now they're actually smooth. We can definitely do a subdivision on them. You can do it here, subdivision surface. You can do it here before, so you can actually see it subdivided. You can't do it afterwards because these are instances, and so they're not real, but you can definitely realize instances. And now the subdivision is applied to them. So yeah, I'm just going to remove realize instances just because it's really heavy and you only need it for certain things. And I'm going to remove the subdivision. You can definitely add it beforehand. And this is how I scatter objects on the screen. If you have objects that require a difference or a random rotation, then you can definitely add this to the rotation and it's going to rotate each one on a different axis randomly. So for the saffron spice particles, I did have a random rotation as well because that has a beginning and an end, but with spheres, you don't really see it. Okay, let's go to the thumbnail so I can explain what I did over there. As you can see, the first thing over here is me using the Voronoi texture in order to pin certain parts of the mesh so I can inflate the others. And then here is me just scattering a bunch of icosphere, I think. Yeah, this is points on a curve or curves 2 points. So I do have a Bezier curve that I drew. So if I go to edit mode, actually, if I select the right object, if I go to edit mode, then you can see that it's drawn. We can isolate it so you can see it and then bring it back. Go out of edit mode. And I've just put a bunch of icospheres as well on the curve. And then with this one, I changed the position of each vertex based on a Voronoi texture. So if I turn on the view, you can actually see the black parts are going inward and the whites are going out. And then I subdivided it, set a material even here through geometry nodes. And this final one is a little bit more complicated and it's new for me as well. So I just needed to put something in here that was new to me so I can practice with you. I like to learn something new with every tutorial I make if I can. So this is basically creating a sine wave on a curve. So if I put this right here, you can see this is the actual geometry. This is the beginning geometry. And then I resampled the curve, meaning I changed the number of points on it so we can actually play around with it. And then I set a curve radius, but it's not really showing anything because it has to be applied to the curve to mesh in order to actually see a radius to it. And because the radius of the set curve radius is changing values using the sine wave, it gives me this look. And of course, because I'm inputting the set curve radius to the curve to mesh, and then I'm adding a curve circle to it, you can definitely add the curve circle directly, but I also resampled the curve for that one. Although it's really not necessary, I just needed to use the length of this for the resample curve because here I can just change the resolution. And now I'm actually adding a circle to the mesh. So I'm adding depth to the mesh using a circle. But the circle with the curve radius is changing its radius based on the sine wave over here. But the sine wave is not just a sine wave. So if I actually plot this over here, you're going to see that it's an actual sine wave. But because I'm applying this, the map range to it, I can remap the values of the sine wave in order to make it look the way I want it to look. And then I added a subdivision surface to the mesh. So it's cleaner. And then I added a set shade smooth, which is not necessarily showing any differences. And then I finally set the material, but you're not going to see this because we're not in material mode. So we can go there. and you can actually see that I do have a material on it. I go to the shading tab. You can see that I'm adding a wave texture as a displacement, and so it's creating these extra waves on top of my shape. So you can definitely play around with that as well. And this is where I also used geometry nodes in order to create two different materials. So I have this first material, which has an emission, an orange emission, so it lights up a little bit. And then another material that is colored to pink that doesn't really have much. And I mixed the two shaders, and I outputted them. I also have a Voronoi texture for displacements. You can see those little circles on here. And I used the color attribute from geometry nodes to exclude these parts. So I only want it on the inflated parts. So that's another way you can use geometry nodes. Yeah, that's pretty much all I did for the geometry nodes thumbnail. I hope that you like this tutorial and that it's not that advanced for you. I just wanted to give you a little look into everything that I use in my Bookstagram. Again, if you have any questions, you can definitely write it in the comments below, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye!